Should the NHS be less reliant on foreign doctors and nurses? Former Test and Trace boss Baroness Harding is applying to be the head of the National Health Service and reportedly wants to be less dependent on staff trained abroad. Foreigners.
Around 14% of NHS staff aren't British-born, including nurse May Parsons from the Philippines. She, of course, made history when giving the world's first COVID vaccine back in December.
We're joined now by A&E doctor and broadcaster Dr Saliha Hassan, who says the NHS needs foreign doctors, and former Health Minister Edwina Currie, who says we should train more medical professionals in the UK. Let's come to you first, Edwina. Why is it important? What's the distinction? Why do we need more trained medical professionals from the UK than trained medical professionals from abroad? What's the difference?
Well, we do have more trained medical professionals from the UK, but at the moment we've had about 15% of the people working in the NHS are born overseas, and it's about 28% of our doctors. It's a lot. We are heavily dependent on people coming in from overseas. And actually, the real problem is not where people come from. It's that we are taking trained people, I think, from much poorer countries, like the Philippines, much poorer countries. They are being trained by their own taxpayers, and then we pinch them. We persuade them to come here. And we're doing that because it's cheaper for us. It seems to me an appalling form of colonialism, and it's not a good thing to do. We ought to be looking much better, much more at how we use the staff that we do train, why we aren't able to employ as many of our own doctors, why people leave the NHS, whether we can perhaps upskill some of the people already working in the NHS, like going from nursing up to perhaps being a nurse practitioner. There's a whole host of issues there. But the way we've been doing it for years, actually, I think is not defensible. Okay. It's not a good way of going about.
Well, let's put that to Dr Saliha Hassan. Dr Saliha, when this story emerged yesterday in the Sunday Times, some people were outraged because they thought it was a sort of insult to those foreign-born, foreign-trained medical professionals working here in the NHS, that it was a sort of sign of ingratitude towards those who have been doing such an incredible job during coronavirus and the pandemic. But what do you make of what Edwina Currie says, which is we are sort of taking away those critical workers from the countries where they're also suffering?
Yeah, I understand that. This is a controversial area. First of all, I have colleagues who are people who have gained their medical degrees from overseas, and I've spoken to them since this report in the papers yesterday, and they are deeply hurt, and they feel that, it's like a kick in the teeth, and yes, a sense of ingratitude for the sacrifices and the hard work and commitment that they have given to the NHS, not just in the last year, but for the last few years, and at great personal cost. Yes, this idea, this concept of the brain drain, it's not as simple as that. What happens when colleagues come from overseas, where they have trained and often plan to return home, actually, is an international collaboration. Collaboration happens between two countries. Relationships are formed. There is cross-fertilization of knowledge. People from over here go and work over in the countries. For example, India, teaching, collaboration. The Royal College of Emergency Medicine has done this in the bucket loads. There we have training days where staff from India, from Bangladesh and from other areas, especially in Southeast Asia, where collaboration and training and insight is shared. This isn't just a one-way street. And that view, that perspective, it is oversimplifying.
OK. So you say it's a matter of international collaboration. But what about the point that one of the reasons that we're so reliant on medical professionals coming from overseas is because this government simply doesn't want to invest the money in doctors and nurses training here. Edwina Curry, I mean, is this actually a criticism of our own government that we won't spend the money? We're doing it on the cheap.
Well, I don't think you can ever do medical training or nursing training on the cheap.
Well, if it's much cheaper to bring in someone from abroad than to invest that money in the training here, then you are doing it on the cheap, aren't you?
It's much easier to bring people in from abroad than to look at why you haven't retained the staff that you have trained. It's much easier for it's NHS managers. It's not just a particular government. This has been going on for years. It's much easier just to put an advert in Manila newspapers and know that people will respond, and they will be of very, very high quality, absolutely wonderful people. And then to think, you know, why are we losing people in our own hospital? Why are people not prepared to work? Why are people not prepared to put up with the very long hours and so on? Somewhere along the line, we need to do some thinking about it. The government has recently decided to restore the bursaries for nurse training, and I was cheering when they did that. I thought the idea of making our nurses having to pay so much more for their training was absolutely wrong. But there's got to be some real thinking about the management of staff within the NHS and the recruitment of people locally. It's also wrong, isn't it, that we have unemployment here and we talk about that.
Edwina, you know, I find it quite disgusting, really. I mean, this is Britain. In the 1950s and 60s, Britain had no choice but to ask doctors from India and Pakistan to come to this country to save the NHS. They stood up in Parliament and said that the NHS would collapse. This is in 1961. They stood up in Parliament and said NHS would collapse. It wasn't for migrant doctors. Those migrant doctors have held up this country, have held up the NHS. 127,000 people have died in the last year. Many tens more thousands would have died if it wasn't for migrant workers. They are British. And as soon as somebody comes to this country to work here, they are then British. This idea that we should talk about our own. Who are our own? Was my father a migrant? Was he our own? We are all our own. I just don't get this idea that suddenly the migrants who have been here for 50, 60 years and will continue to come here aren't British. They are our own too. And I just can't... who do we mean? Who do you actually mean by, say, our own? Somebody who was only born in the UK? Their parents were only born in the UK? How long do they have to have been here?
Calm down. You're turning into Piers Morgan. I think you can do better than that. My grandparents...
I don't care who I'm turning into. We're talking about a really important subject. I don't care about who I'm turning into. Just tell me what is the difference between our own and people like my father?
Yeah, and what you've also forgotten is that the Minister of Health who stood up in the House of Commons and made the remarks that you're just saying was actually Enoch Powell. And look where that led.
No, it wasn't. It was Lord Cohen of Birkenhead in the Lord's debate in 1961, actually.
It was also...
So it was, I'm not talking about rivers of blood. I'm not talking about rivers of blood.
Enoch Powell. That's right. Now, look, it shouldn't be as emotional as this. We really need to look at the way we need to look at the way we manage staff. We need to look at the way that we retain staff. We need to look at the way we train staff in the NHS. Even if we started now to increase the number of doctors being trained, it would be 7 or 8 years before we got the benefit from that. But it just isn't right to take the best trained people from some of the poorest countries in the world. Their own countries need them. And then we're being asked to have more foreign aid in order to assist those countries. This doesn't kind of make any kind of sense to me. Somewhere along the lines, we need to make sure that we're looking after staff better. We need to look at the patterns of staffing in the NHS and to ensure that we don't have to rely.
Would you look at
our doctors?
Would you look at other industries too then? Would you look at other industries? Hospitality, catering, law, the tech business? They're all immigrants who've come from their countries, and those industries suffer as well. So should we start, once we've picked on the NHS, should we say we don't want any more immigrant cab drivers? We should be doing that ourselves because they should be contributing to their own economy back in Kenya, Pakistan and India. Where do you draw the line with this, Edwina?
Well, you can widen it. You can draw the line wherever you like.
Right. So you could go beyond that. Right,
you
fine.
Asked me a question. You asked me a question.
It's extraordinary, Edwina.
training a doctor is a very, very expensive thing. It's a very long thing, and it costs the taxpayer a great deal of money. It actually costs the person who's training a lot of money as well. And we need to think about how that resource is being used and why we lose people. We train up a lot more doctors than we used to, but we actually employ far fewer of the people we train. That's partly because we have more doctors that do childcare and other issues. It's a very different world. We need to think about, it's a management issue, and it's an employment issue, and it's a staff welfare issue as well.
Okay.
We shouldn't have to be so dependent on people that we ship in from overseas. It's not fair and it's not right.
Okay, Dr. Salia, we have an issue as well with, we have an issue with how we treat our NHS staff generally. One of the nurses who treated Boris Johnson came from New Zealand and is leaving the NHS and returning to New Zealand. That is part of the problem, isn't it? You can either see that as a problem with if you employ foreign-trained workers, the risk is, of course, that they may want to go home at some stage and you don't retain them and their valuable skills within the NHS. But you also have an issue about how we treat and pay our workers here on the front line.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I just want to put a figure to the some of the stuff that's going on. It costs about £220,000 to train a doctor. It takes up to 10 years, actually, from medical school to becoming a GP, and longer for other specialities. This is going to be a lengthy process to have that kind of ambition. The NHS, working in the NHS compared to working in other developed countries is a really tough call. It is. I consider it, I work a lot within the humanitarian sector. When I'm working on my A&E shifts, I actually consider that the stress and the pressure that's involved, I actually consider that conducive to helping me in my role when I'm in an austere setting. Going back home, going back to the countries where people have been, born and raised, trained, and then come over here, that is not uncommon, because they come and work over here. They realise that it's challenging. Life back at home and working back in New Zealand and Australia is actually far more favourable. You just have to look at hospitals in Australia and New Zealand to see the number of UK doctors and nurses who are working out there. Within the UK, pay, working conditions, the rota, the work-life balance falls below the standards in other countries.
Right, okay.
If you compare those issues, if you compare those two, working in the NHS is actually not as attractive. Okay. So it's not right that people leave.
Dr. Salia Ahsan and Edwina Currie, former Health Minister, thanks very much indeed. Dr. Hillary, I think a number of people who have come from abroad to work in the NHS may have found what was said yesterday insulting. We mustn't rely on foreigners anymore to work in the NHS. Of course, they're absolutely critical to the operation of the NHS.
Totally.
But can you understand this? It depends how you look at this argument, isn't it? Because I'm very uncomfortable with this idea that we're sort of acting as a parasite on other countries where those skills are needed. But we want to value our foreign-born, foreign-trained workers here in the NHS, because without them we wouldn't survive.
We wouldn't survive. And we are totally dependent on nurses and doctors who come from overseas to work within our NHS. The last 4 ambulance crews that I've worked with in my job have been from Australia. Sri Lankans, Filipinos, they make the most compassionate and caring of carers and nurses. Doctors from overseas have got some of the most skilled jobs in kidney disease, in surgery, and we're totally dependent. We could not exist in the NHS without them. And yes, you're right, we are taking some of those skilled workers from poorer countries who've trained those doctors, and we've got the benefit of them. One of the problems we have here, one of the reasons we have a shortage of doctors who are home trained is because they don't want to work after they qualify as doctors.
Really?
So the number of people who qualify as doctors who never practice medicine would shock you. They do the...
What do they do then?
They get their degree and they're headhunted for jobs elsewhere in the city or doing something completely...
Not doing medicine
not doing medicine
so not
at
even
all.
that they go into the private sector and don't contribute towards the NHS.
Exactly. And I would favour something like the military do with the Short Service Commission, that if you get your degree, your medical degree, you're trained in this country, you're obliged to do at least 3 to 5 years.
Have you got figures?
In some medical schools, up to 20%.
Really?
Yeah, you'd be shocked.
That is...
these are the figures that I last saw. And they look at the job and they say, well, that's not attractive to me. Now I know what the job entails. Now I know that morale is so low, the workload is so high, and the pay, well, you know, you can argue about the pay, but it's a job that they don't consider attractive once they get to that point of getting their degree, which has cost the taxpayer £225,000. I think an apprenticeship traineeship would be better than the orthodox training that doctors have. It's very regimented. Not all of it is relevant. It should be tailored to the kind of role you want to play as a doctor once you qualify. Now, I know I'm going on a bit about this, but it's quite passionate for me.
Of course.
But absolutely, overseas workers, we are totally dependent on, and we will be for at least another decade.
And I completely get this idea that, you know, we are taking away great skills from this country, but that's always happened in nations, in trade and everywhere. And there's that balance to strike between, you know, a person's right to leave a country and work somewhere else and what other countries need, but it's about, you know, reciprocating that with aid and support.
And equally, some of our very good doctors who are homegrown go overseas. They work on surgeonships, do cataract surgery, doing all sorts of you know, cleft palate surgery. So it's give and take, but it is imbalanced at the moment.
OK, thank you, Hill.